December 1989, Rogers Pass, British Columbia. A wall of snow and ice tears down the mountainside, sweeping away power transmission towers like matchsticks. In seconds, the town of Revelstoke is plunged into darkness. Outside, the temperature reads -30 Celsius and falling. Inside the regional hospital, backup generators kick on with a shudder, their diesel engines straining against the sudden load. The town's officials face an impossible question. How do you keep a community alive when every modern solution has failed? What happened next became a feat most people have never heard of. A machine built for another era rewrote what was possible in a crisis. The darkness in Revelstoke deepened as the hours crawled forward. Power vanished from the hospital's upper floors, the emergency operations center, and the main community shelter on 2nd Street. Inside the hospital, emergency room director Sarah Mitchell stood beneath failing fluorescent lights, watching her team work faster, knowing the clock was against them. The backup generators, designed for hours, not days, rumbled in the basement with a sound that felt more ominous with each passing minute. In the intensive care unit, frost began forming on the inside corners of windows. Nurses moved between beds, checking IV lines and monitor connections, their breath visible in the cooling air. Patients, wrapped in extra blankets, watched ceiling lights flicker and dim. The building's heat, dependent on electric pumps and blowers, was fading. Thermostats showed interior temperatures dropping toward 15 degrees Celsius in the outer corridors. Across town, families huddled in living rooms with fireplaces, burning furniture when the firewood ran out. Elderly residents, many living alone, faced a cold that crept through walls and floors designed for a world with reliable electricity. Pipes began to freeze and burst, adding water damage to the growing crisis. The shelter coordinator reported capacity exceeded, with families sleeping in hallways and storage rooms anywhere out of the wind. At Town Hall, Mayor David Chen stood by a darkened window, looking toward the avalanche zone where transmission towers lay buried beneath 40 feet of compacted snow. The call to BC Hydro had brought grim news. Repair crews couldn't safely reach the damaged infrastructure. The avalanche risk remained critical. Restoration estimates stretched to 7, perhaps 10 days. The hospital administrator's voice still echoed in his mind. 18 hours of backup power remaining, surgeries postponed, life support systems prioritized, decisions no one should have to make. The town's options narrowed with each update. Trucking in enough diesel through avalanche-threatened mountain passes was impossible. The damaged transmission lines couldn't be bypassed. Every neighboring community faced the same storm, the same cold, the same darkness. In the hospital basement, the backup generators continued their steady rumble, burning through fuel reserves measured now in hours rather than days. For those monitoring the gauges, the question was no longer if the power would fail, but when. And what would happen to the people depending on machines to keep them breathing when it did? A steam locomotive is not just a machine built to haul freight. At its core, it is a mobile power plant, a factory on wheels designed to convert solid fuel into tremendous amounts of thermal energy. Canadian Pacific's H1e number 2860, sitting quiet in the Revelstoke railway yard, represented something far beyond its role pulling passenger cars on summer heritage runs. This machine, built in 1938 for conquering Rogers Pass with heavy freight, harbored capabilities most modern engineers had forgotten. The H1e's massive boiler, stretching nearly the length of a boxcar, could generate superheated steam at 275 pounds per square inch. Inside that steel vessel, coal burned at temperatures exceeding 1,300 degrees Celsius, heating hundreds of tubes through which water circulated and transformed into steam. In normal operation, that steam drove pistons connected to 10 massive driving wheels, producing over 60,000 pounds of tractive effort. But the steam itself, the raw thermal energy, could serve another purpose entirely. Unlike a diesel-electric locomotive that converts fuel into electricity through an alternator, a steam engine creates its power through heat and pressure. The boiler doesn't care whether steam drives pistons for wheels or spins turbines for generators. With the right connections, the same superheated steam that once pulled tonnage over mountain grades could drive electrical generation equipment. A single H1e boiler, operating at capacity, could theoretically produce between 1 and 2 megawatts of electrical power if coupled to appropriate steam turbines and generators. That output rivaled multiple portable diesel generators, but with one critical advantage. The locomotive burned coal, and Revelstoke had stockpiles meant for industrial heating, weeks of supply sitting in covered bins across town. Number 2860 had been retired from mainline service in the 1950s, preserved by railway enthusiasts and maintained in working order for excursion runs. That preservation, driven by nostalgia and historical interest, meant the locomotive sat ready in Revelstoke with everything it needed. The railway yard still had functioning water towers and coal bunkers. More importantly, 3 retired Canadian Pacific engineers lived in town, men who had spent careers firing and operating these exact machines through the worst mountain winters the Selkirks could deliver. The concept was sound in theory, but theory and desperate reality stood miles apart. Steam locomotives were never designed for stationary power generation. Running a boiler at continuous high capacity for days on end created thermal stresses these machines rarely experienced. The risk of catastrophic boiler failure, of a pressure vessel explosion that could level city blocks, loomed over every calculation. No engineering manual documented this conversion. No safety protocol existed for tying a heritage steam locomotive into a municipal electrical grid. The liability exposure stretched beyond imagination. Yet, as the hospital's backup generators burned toward empty and BC Hydro's restoration timeline stretched past a week, the impossible began to look like the only option. Someone would need to say yes to an experiment no railroad had ever attempted, staking lives and infrastructure on technology the modern world had abandoned decades before. Mayor Chen placed the call to Canadian Pacific's Operations Center in Calgary just after midnight. The dispatcher who answered handled freight schedules and track maintenance, not emergency power requests from municipal governments. The mayor's words hung in the air for a long moment. "We need to use your steam locomotive as a generator." The dispatcher, confused, put him on hold. Trains moved cargo, they didn't power towns. This request made no sense. Within minutes, the question traveled up the chain. Operations manager to regional vice president to corporate engineering to the legal department. Each conversation raised new concerns. Insurance policies didn't cover locomotives being used as municipal infrastructure. What if the boiler exploded in a residential area? What if the electrical connection failed and sent power surging back into damaged lines where BC Hydro crews might be working? Who would be responsible if someone died? The engineering team in Calgary pulled blueprints and specifications, running calculations on paper and arguing over coffee about thermal limits and pressure tolerances. Could an H1e boiler sustain full capacity operation for a week straight? The machines were built tough, designed for the punishment of mountain railroading, but this pushed beyond any documented use case. Corporate engineers trained on modern diesel-electric systems questioned whether the conversion was even possible. There were no blueprints for this, no precedent to follow. Just theory and desperation. The legal concerns multiplied with each phone call. Union representatives wanted to know who would operate the locomotive. Railway engineers or municipal workers? Who carried liability if a crew member was injured? What about property damage if something went catastrophically wrong? The public relations team calculated the optics. If Canadian Pacific said yes and the attempt failed spectacularly, the company's name would be tied to a disaster. If they said no and people died in the cold, the headlines would be just as brutal. Then a voice broke through the institutional paralysis. Thomas Barrett, 72 years old, had operated H1e locomotives for Canadian Pacific for 30 years before retirement. He lived in Revelstoke and had been following the crisis from his living room. When word of the proposal reached him through old railway contacts, he made a call to Calgary himself. "The boiler can handle it," he told the corporate engineers. "I've run these machines harder pulling freight over the pass in winter storms. Give me 2 other steam men and we'll make it work." 2 more retired engineers stepped forward within the hour, men who knew every valve and gauge on an H1e, who had spent frozen nights keeping steam pressure steady through mountain grades. Current CP electricians volunteered to rig the turbine connections. A crew was forming, experience and willingness replacing the certainty that engineering manuals couldn't provide. Another update from BC Hydro made the decision urgent. Avalanche crews still couldn't safely access the damaged transmission towers. The restoration timeline pushed past 10 days. At the hospital, the administrator reported 14 hours of backup power remaining. Operating rooms sat dark. Life support systems were prioritized. Patients who could be moved were being transferred, but the roads were treacherous and there was nowhere safe to send them. The regional vice president for Canadian Pacific made the call. Do it. Get that locomotive steamed up. But conditions were set. Constant monitoring of boiler pressure, strict limits on operating parameters, immediate shutdown protocols if anything looked wrong. Canadian Pacific would assume liability for mechanical failure. The town would assume liability for electrical problems. Resources would come from Calgary. A 12-hour window to make the connection before the hospital went dark. Mayor Chen received the news in his cold office. Relief and terror mixed together. They had permission. They had a crew. They had a plan that had never been tested. Now they had to make it work before time ran out. Floodlights illuminated the railway yard as crews converged on locomotive number 2860. The massive machine sat cold and silent, its black paint gleaming with frost under the artificial glare. Thomas Barrett climbed into the cab, his breath clouding in the freezing air, and began the process he had performed thousands of times decades before. Coal went into the firebox first, kindling and wood scraps to start the flame. The fire caught slowly, orange light flickering against soot-stained metal. Building steam pressure from a cold start would take hours, and the hospital had less than 12. While the fire grew, other crew members connected hoses from the water tower. Steam locomotives consumed water at staggering rates, 8,000 gallons per hour when working hard. The yard's water system, maintained for summer excursions, had to be thawed and tested. Dump trucks arrived with coal, positioning tons of fuel within easy reach of the tender. Every 20 minutes, someone would need to shovel coal into that firebox to maintain the heat required for continuous operation. Word spread through Revelstoke despite the late hour. Residents bundled. Against the cold began gathering at the yard's perimeter, drawn by the lights and the smoke starting to rise from 2860's stack. Some brought coffee and food for the crews. Others simply stood watching, silent witnesses to an attempt that felt equal parts desperate and impossible. Steam began to wisp from various points on the locomotive as internal temperatures rose. Pressure gauges, still reading 0, would climb slowly. 150 pounds per square inch. 200, 250. The process could not be rushed without risking thermal shock to cold metal. Canadian Pacific electricians worked under their own floodlights, rigging the conversion equipment that had been trucked from Calgary. A portable steam turbine, designed for industrial applications, was being connected to the boiler's steam line. Heavy gauge cables snaked across frozen ground toward the municipal substation 3 blocks away. The turbine would drive a 1.5 megawatt generator, itself a temporary installation requiring its own connections and safety systems. Every coupling was improvised, engineers solving problems in real time with no blueprint to guide them. At the substation, BC Hydro crews worked to isolate Revelstoke's damaged grid section. The town's electrical system had to be completely separated from the main transmission network to prevent backfeed. If power from the locomotive flowed backward into lines where repair crews might eventually work, the results could be fatal. Switches were opened, connections verified, and isolation confirmed. The town would run as its own island, powered by a machine built before most of the crew had been born. Pressure gauges on 2860 climbed past 200 pounds. Barrett adjusted dampers and checked water levels, his hands moving with the muscle memory of long experience. The firebox roared now, heat radiating through the cab. At 250 pounds per square inch, he opened the valve to divert steam from the main pistons to the turbine connection. A high-pitched whine filled the yard as superheated steam hit turbine blades and spun them toward 3,600 rotations per minute. The generator came alive, meters showing voltage building across its terminals. 100 volts, 300, 600. Frequency had to match the required 60 cycles per second exactly. An electrician monitored the readings, making fine adjustments to turbine speed. At the hospital, backup generators coughed and sputtered, running on fumes now. 2 hours of power remained, perhaps less. At the substation, a municipal electrician stood with his hand on the main breaker that would connect locomotive to grid. Radio confirmation crackled through. Ready on the locomotive, ready at the substation. Barrett's voice came through steady and calm. "Close it." The breaker slammed home with a metallic clunk that echoed in the frozen night. Lights flickered in the hospital emergency room, then glowed steady and bright. Medical. Equipment hummed back to life, monitors displaying vital signs that had been dark moments before. Heating systems kicked on with a rush of warm air through vents. Emergency room director Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still, watching the transformation, then pressed both hands to her face. In the intensive care unit, nurses exhaled relief as ventilators resumed their rhythmic cycling. Surgery teams received word to prepare operating rooms. The procedures postponed in darkness could now proceed. At Town Hall, Christmas lights strung along the building's facade illuminated spontaneously, casting colored light across snow-covered streets. Residential blocks nearest the hospital substation saw power return to homes that had been cold and dark for days. At the railway yard, the sound that would define the next 10 days began. The steady chuff of steam exhaust, the rumble of coal fire, smoke rising black against the night sky. Thomas Barrett stood in the cab with his hand on the throttle, maintaining steady pressure, beginning what he knew would be a marathon of endurance. The first 24 hours established the routine that would sustain the town. Crews worked in 8-hour shifts, 3 retired engineers rotating through the cab. Coal consumption ran at 2 tons per hour, an endless cycle of shoveling fuel into the firebox. Water evaporated at 8,000 gallons per hour, requiring constant monitoring and refilling from the tower. The physical toll mounted quickly. Shoveling coal in a hot cab while outside temperatures sat at -30 created a brutal contrast. Engineers emerged from shifts soaked with sweat that froze on their clothes in minutes. Power output held steady at 1.2 megawatts, feeding the hospital, town hall, emergency shelter, and water pumping stations. Gauge checks every 15 minutes, coal every 20 minutes, water levels watched constantly. Any variation in pressure or temperature could signal disaster. The work was exhausting, repetitive, and absolutely critical. Every shovelful of coal translated directly to power keeping people alive. On the 3rd day, a small leak appeared in one of the boiler tubes. Water misted into steam where it shouldn't, pressure dropping slightly. The crew patched it while maintaining operation, unable to shut down for proper repairs. Some coal deliveries arrived too wet from snow, reducing burn efficiency and requiring higher feed rates to maintain heat. The temperature outside dropped to -35, freezing water lines and requiring emergency installation of heat trace cables. Volunteers from town began arriving to help. Residents who couldn't operate the locomotive could shovel coal, giving aging engineers brief respite. Others brought food, coffee, and supplies. Children came with parents to watch the machine working, a strange mixture of emergency and wonder. The railway yard became a gathering point. The locomotive's smoke and steam visible across town, signaled that power continued, that the gamble was holding. By day 6, BC Hydro crews finally reached the damaged transmission towers and began repairs. By day 8, partial grid restoration reached western Revelstoke. On day 10, full restoration was announced. After 240 hours of continuous operation, 480 tons of coal, and 1.9 million gallons of water, Thomas Barrett closed the steam valve. The chuffing stopped. Smoke cleared. Pressure bled down. The silence felt strange after so long. Canadian Pacific's mechanical team arrived from Calgary the morning after shutdown, conducting a thorough inspection of locomotive 2860. Every component that had endured 10 days of continuous operation needed examination. The boiler underwent pressure testing, engineers checking welds and tube connections for stress fractures. Remarkably, the vessel had held. Minor tube repairs were needed where small leaks had developed, but the core structure remained sound. The turbine required bearing replacement from sustained high-speed rotation, but the improvised system had functioned beyond expectations. The final accounting showed 480 tons of coal consumed, crew wages, equipment rental, maintenance, and repairs. Total cost approached $180,000. Town officials compared that figure to the alternative. Evacuating hospital patients by helicopter through avalanche threatened passes would have cost over $2 million with substantial risk of lives lost in transit. Money spent versus lives saved. There was no contest. Canadian Pacific's Engineering Division produced a detailed report documenting the conversion process, challenges encountered, and solutions implemented. The report became the first documentation of steam locomotive emergency power generation. Other railways requested copies. Emergency management agencies studied the precedent. The Smithsonian contacted Canadian Pacific requesting documentation for their archives. Locomotive 2860 returned to Heritage Railway service the following summer but carried new significance for Revelstoke. A plaque was installed at the railway yard commemorating December 1989 when a locomotive built in 1938 kept their town alive. Families brought children to see the machine, explaining how it had powered homes and hospital when everything modern failed. North American electrical infrastructure continues aging while extreme weather increases. Mountain communities face growing avalanche risks as climate patterns shift. Modern solutions like battery storage and mobile generators depend on fuel supply chains that disasters can disrupt. The lesson from 2860 was that old technology offered resilience modern systems sometimes lack. A steam locomotive needs only coal, water, and human expertise. No complex electronics, no refined petroleum dependencies. The simplicity that made steam obsolete became an asset when sophisticated systems collapsed. Emergency planners in other communities began studying Revelstoke, considering what unconventional resources might exist in their regions. Museums with operational equipment, industrial facilities with boilers, any machine generating power independent of standard infrastructure. The concept of maintaining diverse technological capabilities rather than depending entirely on centralized modern systems gained traction in disaster preparedness. The paradox remained striking. A locomotive built in the 1940s, retired as obsolete in the 1950s, saved lives in 1989 using 19th century technology. That machine now sits preserved. A reminder that crisis forces creativity and that willingness to attempt the unprecedented can mean survival. In an era of increasing grid failures and extreme weather, Revelstoke's question grows more relevant. When modern infrastructure fails and lives hang in balance, what unconventional solutions exist in your community? What machines, knowledge, or expertise sits waiting, ready to bridge the gap between darkness and light? The next crisis won't wait for perfect solutions. It will demand whatever works. Share your thoughts on infrastructure resilience below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and give this video a like if you enjoyed it. See you on the next one.